For our keynote speaker today, we're very pleased and fortunate to have Dr. Amy Donahue from Kennesaw State University. She completed her PhD in philosophy from the University of Hawaii, Manoa. That's how you say it? Manoa. She also completed a graduate certificate in feminist studies. Dr. Donahue's specialty is Indian philosophy, feminist and gender theory and theories of knowledge. Her recent work does focus on the integration of post-colonial and decolonial theory, and that's related to some of the things she's going to talk to us about today. She's co-edited a special issue of comparative and continental philosophy with Dr. Rohan Kailan of Virginia Tech, and the theme of that issue is decolonializing comparative mythologies. That'll be forthcoming in the fall. She also has a chapter forthcoming entitled Hinduism and Disability with Baylor University Press. Last year she published in the October issue of Philosophy East-West. Her article is entitled Suffering Free Markets, a Classical Buddhist Critique of Capitalist Conceptions of Value. Her most recent article is entitled Coloniality in Buddhist Philosophy. It's currently under peer review and part of a larger project that she's working on, which is tentatively entitled Styles of Critique. Today, Dr. Donahue is going to talk about diversity within academic philosophy and related to some issues of classic Buddhist philosophy. So we're pleased to have her here. Thank you for.
Great, thank you very much. Cool, thanks a lot all. And really nice to see such a really diverse group of people here at Clayton State, and very much appreciate the invitation. Very thoughtful and generous of you. And I'm looking to keep this really as casual as possible today, mainly because I think that's a more appropriate style for conference presentations, or at least a more hopefully enjoyable style. But also because these are ideas that I'm working on right now, and really they're not in a polished form, right? I'm brainstorming, working through these concepts at the moment, or at least aspects of the concepts. Before starting off, I just want to let you know, for those of you who are interested, and it appears that you are, in undergraduate and graduate philosophy conferences, my home department, Kennesaw State University, is going to host a conference, a student philosophy conference, from March 27th to March 28th this year, and the call for papers is still open. My home department is at Kennesaw State University, and it's just up the road, just north of Atlanta. So, friendly group of people. Hopefully, some of you can make it. We definitely encourage submissions. The keynote speaker is Professor Dr. Julia Janssen, and she's a Kantian out of Leuven University in Belgium. So just to let you know, the deadline is March 1st, and just let me know if I can share the instructions on how to submit a paper. Okay, so aside from that shameless plug for my home department, I just want to start off with a question. Not a rhetorical question, but a question that I'd like to hear some answers to. And that question is, what is philosophy? Right? Not a trick question. Right? When you think of philosophy, what do you think? Yes, please.
Love of wisdom.
Great. Right? Love of wisdom. Other answers? Yes, please.
Formulating good questions.
Formulating good questions? What makes a question good?
Finding out what makes a question good.
Okay, good. And what's the motivation for doing philosophy? One is a kind of love. Yeah.
The decision.
What's that?
The decision to involve oneself in reality.
Okay, but I mean, am I doing philosophy if I'm trying to figure out what to order for lunch? Right? So it's a kind of decision making, or it's a kind of exploration. But what is it that's propelling my inquiry?
I'm comfortable with the idea of philosophy as a way for, I'm saying, an inner harmony, an inner peace.
Okay, great. Have you ever read that on a North American website for a philosophy department?
Not for philosophy.
Right. I mean, so if we go to philosophy websites here in the United States, or even we remember back what we learned in our introduction to philosophy classes, what is philosophy? Love of wisdom is one clear answer. Right. Strangely, I was looking at the Kennesaw State University philosophy website, and strangely, we apparently don't say anything about philosophy. In fact, we kind of get subsumed underneath the history because it's a history and philosophy department. All right, so there's no explanation of what philosophy is on our websites. But I did go to the Clayton State website. And like us, but in a much better shape, you don't define what philosophy is, at least that I could see on your website, at least not in the front. Instead, you've got this glorious fresco by Raphael, right, complete with togas and men gesticulating, right? So, that's part of what people think of when they think, or when we think of philosophy. Further on, in the Clayton State University website, you get a bit of an explanation of what philosophy is. It states that philosophy asks fundamental and enduring questions. Who am I? What can I know? How should I act? And then building off the love of wisdom. Sorry, what was your name?
Dana.
Okay, Dana's love of wisdom. That's spot on with the APA self-description, the American Philosophical Association self-description. So the APA, in a 2007 statement, initially gestures toward the reality that there are irreducibly diverse understandings of philosophy in the discipline. But then it acknowledges, like Deleuze and Guattari in What is Philosophy, they acknowledge that the discipline philosophy has been shaped by an intellectual and historical tradition that began some 2,500 years ago in the Greek culture of the Eastern Mediterranean region, although similar developments also occurred independently elsewhere in other cultures, both earlier and subsequently. In the language of ancient Greeks, philosophy literally meant love of wisdom. Right? So you're ready to serve on the APA. Drafting these statements. Hurrah. All right. So philosophy is love of wisdom, love of truth. As you probably know, I'm looking to problematize this conception. But I'm going to start off by pointing to something I think that you're probably all familiar with, which is that philosophy right now at the institutional space of the North American Academy faces a crisis of diversity. It's increasingly recognized to be, philosophy is increasingly recognized to be a strikingly homogeneous discipline. So, according to the U.S. Department of Education's most recent data, traditionally underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities receive less than 13% of BAs in philosophy in the United States, slightly more than 8% of all philosophy MAs, and a little less than 5% of all philosophy PhDs. Right? Now, this is ethnic and racial minorities as a group, right? They're including Asian, they're including Pacific Islander, they're including African American, they're including Latino, right? Across the board, 5%, less than 5% of philosophy PhDs. With respect to women, about 30% of philosophy degrees at all levels are completed by women. I believe that's as of 2009. But only about 25% of the members who reported to the APA in 2014 identified as women. And data suggests that the number of women faculty working in tenured or tenure track positions is significantly lower. About 11% of the members who reported to the APA in 2014 that they work in philosophy in some regular capacity identified as members of traditionally underrepresented racial or ethnic minorities. Again, it's hard to get hard data. Indications are that only about 1 to 3% of professional philosophers in the United States are African American. And of course, this representation plummets when the categories of gender and race intersect. All right, so according to a recent estimate, and this was, I believe, by Sally Haslinger in the New York Times, part of the Stone series, according to her estimate, there are only 31 black female tenure or tenure-track philosophy professors employed in the entire United States. 31. There was a Guardian UK article recently that said that in the United Kingdom, there are only 2 women of color faculty members. I'm not sure. Maybe, yeah, women of color faculty members. Okay, so philosophy as a discipline at the institutional site of the university is not only the most homogeneous, non-diverse field within the humanities, it's also one of, and perhaps the most homogeneous and non-diverse fields in the entire academy, including STEM fields. Now, it could be, there could be all sorts of different reasons for this, but obviously I want to problematize a particular conception of philosophy, and specifically a conception of philosophy that identifies its origins within the Greek tradition. Before doing that, though, I want to also gesture toward or recognize that there are some apparent signs of quote-unquote progress with respect to philosophy's diversity crisis. First off, we are finding increasingly subjects taught within institutional spaces of philosophy departments that pertain to voices other than those of white, heterosexual men. For instance, we're seeing increasing space within the APA for even at places like the Eastern Division meetings with presentations and panels on philosophies of race, East Asian, South Asian, Latin American, Caribbean, African American philosophies, even queer theory. There's certainly a committee on LGBTIQ philosophies. All of these are increasingly visible. Linda Martine Alcoff, a Panamanian philosopher and decolonial theorist, chaired the APA's Eastern Division from 2012 to 2013. And then also New York Times has been running a regular series, the Stone blog, where regularly and routinely they address issues of philosophy's homogeneity and the not only indifference, but in many cases hostility to exploring questions of racial gender embodiment within the institutional space of the Philosophy Academy. Okay, so I don't usually work with stats, and I certainly don't usually work with numbers, and I've thrown a lot out at you. And so I'm wondering if anybody has any questions or concerns before I move on to the next point. Yes, please.
I'm just kind of curious, do you have any statistics on disabled philosophers?
Great question. Yeah, Anita Silva does some great work there. And in terms of the actual numbers, it's again a highly underrepresented group. So yeah, philosophy of disability is certainly not widely taught. And part of this, you see this within the Stone debates, is that there's at least one approach to philosophy that assumes that we need to abstract away from conditions of embodiment, that somehow we can arrive at truths that will be true for all of humanity, regardless of class position, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of disability, regardless of gender, etc. Right? And to that extent, increasingly, the more that people talk about positions of embodiment, circumstances of embodiment, the more that just doesn't sound like philosophy, at least within some schools. Other questions? I think that's a good one. Yeah? So we all good? All right. Basically, before evaluating these signs of progress that I mentioned, right, increasingly we have subjects such as, I teach a feminist philosophy course, I teach an Indian philosophy course. I mentioned to Dr. Lal before that 5 of the 6 full-time faculty at my home institution in Kennesaw have some area of specialization in non-Western philosophy, and then 2 of the 6 of us work on social political as well. So these issues, these apparent progress, that these issues are being taught and studied and talked about within at least some philosophy programs. But before questioning this progress and this method of responding to philosophy's homogeneity, I want to just emphasize that philosophy's homogeneity does not just passively happen. So I'm just going to use a few anecdotes. All right, so in a forthcoming article, my colleague Gabriel Siltentenko calls attention to George Yancey's observation in his introduction to philosophy in multiple voices, that his graduate advisor discouraged him from focusing on African American philosophy because it would mark him as someone who has moved outside the legitimate bounds of philosophy. There's also no shortage of others with training in the discipline who recount similar stories. Earlier this year, Eugene Sun Park published an essay explaining that he was leaving the field after 6.5 years of work toward a philosophy PhD because the field is actively hostile at all institutional levels to non-Western philosophers and philosophies. Like Yancey, he paraphrases comments from his professors and advisors that actively discouraged him from pursuing studies in non-Western philosophies and incorporating issues of race in his dissertation. He writes that it's not that women and minorities are inexplicably less interested in the problems of philosophy, it's that women and minorities have not had their fair say in defining what the problems of philosophy are, or what counts as philosophy in the first place. The discipline's homogeneity is also apparent in Judith Butler's description. She gives, I think it's a wonderful chapter at the close of her book, Undoing Gender, where she talks about her experiences as a PhD student at Yale. One of her advisors came in to a course that she was teaching, to see what she was teaching, discovered the content and was just appalled. She'd gone off the rails. And as you may know, she's now employed not in a philosophy department, but in a rhetorical and comparative literature program. So again, it's not that there aren't people in philosophy who don't fit this homogeneous portrait, at least initially. It's that the field, in many cases, not just in the subjects, the content that is taught, right, but in the hostility to different voices, that helps to make sure that our discipline is one of the most homogeneous in not just the humanities, but in the entire academy. Any questions? Comments? Concerns? Okay. All right. Now, I would say that it's clearly the case that the philosophy's institutional homogeneity is an institutional and a political problem. I don't want to assume that it's therefore a philosophical problem. Just to give voice to the possibility that it's not, I want to point out Brian Leiter of the infamous Leiter Report, his response to Park's statement that he was leaving philosophy. All right. So Leiter, editor of the Philosophical Gourmet Report, suggests that the lack of diversity within philosophy is a political problem, but not a philosophical problem. He notes that, and he argues, that departments can't be expected to teach all philosophies. In the same way that some departments prioritize analytic philosophies over continental philosophies, and some continental departments prioritize certain segments of continental philosophy over others, we shouldn't be surprised that philosophy departments, particularly in the Anglo-American Academy, prioritize the Western philosophical tradition over other philosophical traditions. In fact, he contends, we would endanger the cosmopolitan spirit that philosophy aims to conserve, and if we were to accede to demands of, quote, identity politics to guide our philosophical inquiries. So at least for this prominent analytic adjudicator of different departments' ranks, this is essentially a political problem, and insistences or concerns that philosophy be more pluralistic and inclusive, not to be centered around very, 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 very narrow range of subjectivities. He contends that this is a political problem, and that if philosophy academically were to accede to the concerns of those like Yancey, Butler, and Park, that would actually corrupt philosophical inquiry. All right, and just to play with this a little bit more, I want to lend a little bit of support to Leiter before taking it away by drawing on the philosophy of language of an 11th century Buddhist Pramanavadan, and his name is Jnana Sri Mitra. The central thesis of his Apoha Prakaranam, that's a monograph on exclusion, is that exclusion is what is revealed by words and inferential reasons. So, in other words, that what it is that words mean is simply exclusion. If Jnana Sri Mitra is right, then exclusions are inextricable from any understanding of philosophy. There can't be a concept of philosophy that doesn't exclude, and there can't be a practice of philosophizing at the institutional site of the university that does not enact some set of exclusions. In fact, excluding is essentially what philosophy as a concept does. To protest only that philosophy as a discipline excludes some persons and philosophical perspectives is lending preliminary provisional support to Leiter. To misunderstand how concepts work. If philosophy were to exclude nothing, it would cease to exist as a discipline. Now, obviously, we don't need to turn to an 11th century Buddhist philosopher to recognize that exclusions must be an element of any meaningful concept. The threat of relativism can be and has been read as the shadow that the modern Anglo-American philosophical tradition defines itself against. Without excluding it and treating it as a mortal threat, a modern Anglo-American philosophical tradition arguably wouldn't exist. Any questions? How's the protest? Concerns? We all good? Okay, let's see if we're all good, right? Basically, okay, the problem with Leiter's argument, in my view, right, is that he's assuming that all exclusions are equal. Either that or he's pretending to do so. The threat of relativism that philosophy constitutes itself against is racialized and gendered. And these exclusions on the basis of race and gender are very much a legacy of Europe's and global capitalism's colonial history. And to defend this claim, I'm going to turn to the work of Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, as well as Maria Lugonis and Annabelle Chiano. So first off, and I'm going to talk as if these are simply facts, right? If you don't agree with them, let me know, right? And maybe I can provide additional justification. Spivak observes that global capitalism relies on and constructs an international axis that differentiates conditions and subjectivities produced in the center from those produced in the quote-unquote periphery. Historically and economically, global capitalism must, quote, subtract members of working classes in the peripheries from the realization of surplus value and thus from, quote, humanistic training in consumerism. Now, that's all very dense, right? But we can see these things happening out in regular context here in Georgia. So, for instance, current immigration policies, right, that prohibit certain classes of immigrants from attending university. Right? There's a differentiation constructed that marks certain people as legitimate, others as illegitimate. And capitalism, according to Spivak, requires that these boundaries be constructed, that there be a quote-unquote first world, and that there be a quote-unquote third world, that there be a place of due process, that there be a place of participation, of citizenship, in contrast to a third world, which is a place of lack of due process, lack of protections, and oppression. Any questions about that? Okay, so schematically, I'm just going to put this in a bit of a schematic form. If we as a discipline, right, this particular narrow subjectivity that presents itself as us, as the voice of the discipline, if it's going to acquire that status as essentially the money form through which or against which all philosophies are measured, then that cannot occur without acts of geopolitical, economic, and epistemic violence. Right? So not specifically in philosophy. Right? Philosophy would be a part of this. But Spivak is contending that within capitalism, there needs to be a conception of a universal us. That there needs essentially to be a subjectivity, a set of interests that represent themselves as social interests in their direct form. Right? And she's borrowing here from Marx, Volume 1, the early pages, where he's basically elaborating his theory of money. Right? Money expresses the same value. All commodities are exchangeable, need to be exchangeable, not just in capitalist systems, but in non-capitalist systems. However, for a particular commodity to show up as money, it needs to be valued in a different way from all other commodities. Right? In exchange, the value of a particular commodity, a jacket, a purse, a cup of tea, a beer, right? That's valued in relationship to money. Right? That purse is worth X number of dollars, right? And that's how you express its worth, not through itself, but through a relation. Conversely, the way that money expresses value is as what appears to be a natural property. If you pull out a $100 bill, right, you seem to see its value as money within it, even though if you were to tear it apart, right, you would never find this mystical quality of value within the money. According to Marx, this happens not just with money, but also with the subjectivities that are engaged in the work of making money. They need to show up. The interests of making money need to show up as directly social interests. And it's only then that every other subjectivity can be measured in relationship to that set of interests. So sorry, that was a little bit dense, but maybe this will be a little bit clearer. Essentially, there needs to be an axis. Capitalism requires that an axis be drawn between those who have full citizenship, those who are representative, and those that clearly, obviously do not. Now, Maria Lugones, a decolonial theorist and Latin American philosopher, right, she builds off the work of another decolonial theorist, Annabel Chiano, to show that this axis is, number one, integral to modern philosophy, and number two, that it's racialized and gendered. So she builds on Chiano's scholarship to show first that what she calls global Euro-centered capitalist power did not arise from the inherent strengths of modern European ways of knowing and living. According to Chiano, global capitalism works along two structural axes. Neither of these axes has logical priority, and both structure and are structured by all other social facets in the system. I will spare you the details on how these axes interact, but essentially the key thing is that they're mutually dependent. The two axes that he notices, or that he points to first, is modernity, and that depends on the construction of oppositions between the civilized and the uncivilized, the modern and the traditional, and so on. Second, in Keanu scholarship, that access is enabled, right, between the civilized, the uncivilized, through this racial axis. So the international division of labor that Spivak talks about is essentially a racially and it's a racialized and gender-specific division. So global capitalism's first structural axis, according to Keanu, is modernity. And Lugonis notes that this axis works by differentiating the world's population into two groups: superior and inferior, rational and irrational, primitive and civilized, traditional and modern. The superior group is schematically aligned with rationality, civilization, and modernity, while the inferior group is schematically aligned with irrationality, primitivity, and despotism. All right. Now, what Lugonis notes, the way she frames this, is that the world, global capitalism and racism, right, require that the world be constructed into what she calls a light side, right, with normatively positive concepts, and a dark side with the antithesis of normatively positive concepts, right? So light side, dark side. The light side is the global, the normative within contemporary context. The light side is the danger, the threat. Historically, this is one way that the threat of relativism has been signified. So rhetoric that divided the world into light and dark sides proliferated with the rise of capitalism in Europe. And as Lugonis and Keanu emphasized, colonial exclusion served as an element of positive images that capitalism's light side presented to Europeans' cognition. They stressed that European colonial capitalist expansion did not export or impose pre-colonial European ways of living and knowing into colonial contexts, but created new ways of living and knowing through contrast with images and persons they targeted for colonization. Speaking with specific reference to gender, Lugonis writes that colonialism did not impose pre-colonial European gender arrangements on the colonized. It imposed a new gender system that created very different arrangements for colonized males and females than for white bourgeois colonizers. End of quotation. Novel European norms of gender, quote, biological dimorphism, the patriarchic and heterosexual organization of relations, end quote, emerged with modernity and did so in opposition to dark side images of gender subalternity that proliferated during Europe's colonial expansion. And she draws on some really fascinating images of how it is that the association of non-European peoples with inferiority and savagery, danger of traditions and despotism was highly sexualized, right? And she quotes Anne McClintock's Imperial Leather, where they talk, about images where you have women with gigantic penises, right? And you've got men with breasts, feeding. All of these are part of the contrast, the danger, right, that helped to constitute European superiority during the rise of modernity, the rise of global capitalism, and of course the expansion of imperialism and coloniality. Okay, now I wanted to bring those resources in from Spivak, Lugonis, and Keanu because it seems clear to me that when we talk about the exclusions that characterize the discipline right now, they operate along exactly that axis, right? You look at the kinds of philosophies that are excluded, the kinds of philosophies that are dismissed as illegitimate, that people are encouraged not to pursue, and they follow exactly that axis. Right? Don't pursue post-structuralist, feminist, anti-capitalist critiques. Don't pursue queer theory. Don't pursue critical race theory. Don't use them in your dissertation. This is the kind of advice that Yancey received, that Park received, and that Butler received. And what's being constituted here is philosophy, philosophers, as a very narrow and racially and gender-specific discipline. Okay. I said I wasn't going to just talk and it was going to be more casual, but no, let's get intense. Yeah. Okay, so what Leiter's objection ignores is what Spivak calls the international division of labor within global capitalism. What Leiter's comparison of the exclusions of ethnic and gender and racial minorities from philosophy departments is that it's not on a par. These exclusions are not on a par with neglect or ignorance of particular aspects of continental philosophy within an analytic or another continental philosophy department. Instead, these exclusions are required, and in fact they do, construct philosophy at the institutional site of the North American University. Let's just say U.S. University. Okay. So I mentioned before that there have been signs of progress, and I mentioned before that I'm going to raise some concerns about these signs of progress. I'm also going to make a suggestion, and I think time-wise it'll just be a suggestion, about an alternative way of conceiving of philosophy that will help us to dislodge these axes of racial differentiation, gender differentiation that currently constitute the discipline, and render it Eurocentric. Okay. I mentioned before that maybe we could take solace or we could be encouraged by the expansion of subjects such as critical race theory, of Latin American, Caribbean philosophy, of Africa, African American diaspora of philosophies within the site of the university, feminist philosophy, gender philosophy, queer theory. Maybe we can all get excited about that. But I want to point out a possible danger with these attempts to make the discipline more heterogeneous simply by incorporating other aspects into the field. So Spivak argues that efforts such as these, efforts that keep the interests of philosophy intact while incorporating other fields, that essentially this is a safety mechanism. All right, let me switch here. Okay, so Spivak argues in Can the Subaltern Speak that some apparently benevolent gestures of solidarity by progressive first world intellectuals with oppressed quote-unquote third world subjectivities reveal conservative colonial interests. Specifically, she observes that Foucault and Deleuze appear to advocate for the subaltern through references to an undifferentiated global subjectivity of oppressed classes, the masses and the workers' struggle. Yet she sees a practical contradiction between these scholars' valorizations of the oppressed on the one hand and their lack of critical attention to the historical role of the intellectual on the other. Historically, she notes, intellectual classes in colonial contexts, whether colonial or nationalist, have facilitated the silencing of the subaltern, or what she says, those on the margins. And she notes that you could just as well say the silent center. Spivak reads Deleuze and Foucault as attempting to maintain both this tradition and their apparently progressive credentials through a kind of verbal slippage. They speak on behalf of the other, but represent the other through themselves. And in doing so, Spivak argues, they reveal an interest in representing themselves as global and their class locations as invisible or transparent. Therefore, although these scholars purport to undermine the sovereign subjectivity of the West, that is this narrow, light side subjectivity that philosophy as a discipline is currently centered around, they actually reveal an interest in conserving and providing cover for this subject of knowledge. And that's a quote. Spivak accordingly writes that the much publicized critique of the sovereign subject thus actually inaugurates a subject which can appear universal and global and not stand revealed as it truly is, particular and parochial, only by appropriating the other through assimilation. All right, again, heavy, intense stuff. But I want to explain this. Essentially what Spivak is saying is that there's an interest that constitutes the field. And if we assume that everybody has one interest as philosopher, and we neglect the international division of labor that shapes what kind of interest people have, then we're actually, in these gestures of pluralizing the discipline, we're going to end up just providing new cover for the narrow, the racially, the gender, class, narrow conceptions or subjectivity that currently shapes philosophy. So the academic, the historical role of the intellectual within U.S. Northern academies has traditionally been to speak on behalf of all, to be transcendental, to be universal, to reach conclusions about normative responsibilities, about epistemological methods, about proper reasoning that would be applicable to everybody. So the interest of this class of philosophers is essentially, as Spivak said, on the side of the exploiter. So if you keep that interest intact, while at the same time speaking for the other, these efforts at pluralizing the discipline essentially serve only to reconstitute the central position of the subjectivity that philosophy as an institution currently privileges. Does that make sense? Objections, protests, howls. We all good? Yes, please.
I'm just thinking of, in Canada, a lot of First Nations philosophy that's taught in universities is kind of, well, I guess their banner would be something like philosophy for us, by us. So, I mean, that's a political remark, it's also a philosophical remark. But it's not really a question, but it's just a reaction to what you said. So, these groups that are popping up, and more explicitly saying, we realize that this is our contingent, philosophy, which we have to hold dear, and so on. It's not like yours, but they put their cards down on the table, but yet purport to offer objective viewpoints from their subjective viewpoint, nonetheless.
Yeah.
Isn't that just making the same move?
That, I think, would be the nationalist move, right? And not just in terms of first persons, right? But in all sorts of histories, who is the class that's formulating these representations of us, right? And typically, it's not a class that is representative of the population, right? But the issue is essentially one of representation, right? How can one speak on behalf of a class without co-opting and objectifying that class at the same time, right? Yes, please.
Yeah. I'm sorry, were you done?
No, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. No, I was saying that this is actually really a huge issue in the disability community as to what role the parents of the disabled should have.
Yeah.
Like groups like Autism Speaks are run mainly by parents of autism, and the Autism Self-Advocacy Network that really just kind of hates their guts because of that.
Yeah, and like Eve Katay,
Yes.
right, and her care ethics, right, speaking on behalf of. Yeah, and that question of representation is really, it's a troublesome one. But I do want to avoid, right, and problematize the kind of identity politics response, right, which is to say, this is us, this is our voices, and you all are leaving us out without attending to the exclusions that constitute this contrary us, right? So you see this, at least the history of feminist theory can be interpreted, at least in the, since like the 60s with second wave, as within philosophy, as a critique of the masculinist subject, the assertion of a specifically feminist or feminine subjectivity, and then the immediate debate within philosophy about the exclusions that are needed to construct that feminist, feminine subject. All right, so yeah, these are issues that I'm definitely attentive to and appreciate you pointing out. Just to make sense of the notion that anytime like an academic or a group, whether it's a kind of hegemonic subjectivity or whether it's a counter-subjectivity, speaks on behalf of a class, that there's an interest that's motivating that speaking. I want to turn again to Jnana Sri Mitra, Right. Spivak's contention, just as an aside beforehand, Spivak's contention is that these representations of the other, the audience of these representations, are the dominant subject. Right? It's not a matter of representing and advocating for the interests of the excluded. Rather, there's the gesture of representing and advocating for the excluded, while actually speaking to or in reference only to dominant subjectivity. That is, it's happening on the light side of the axis. Okay. Jnaneshri Mitra, in his monograph on exclusion, states that all exclusions, all concept formations, are fueled by desire, by thirsting, by an interest. And so therefore, what's excluded, what's not excluded, is going to hinge on satisfaction. What is satisfactory, what's not satisfactory. So he takes this really mundane example. This road goes to Shrugna, right? A town, a village, right? And we could use this road goes to Atlanta. And he illustrates the principle that exclusion alone determines word meanings through a kind of analytic approach by looking at each of the grammatical parts of the sentence and showing how exclusion works in the determination of the reference of each. So say we're outside and you point and say, hey, this road goes to Atlanta. I'll know what you mean by this, not because you've got laser-like fingers, right, that can specify exactly what you mean, but just because when I see your point, I understand that you're not what you're not pointing at. So I know that you're not just pointing a foot away from you, right? I know that you're not pointing beyond the hill. And it's by excluding these other possibilities that I determine what it is, that thing that you're allegedly pointing at. And then he goes on to the same thing for Shrugna, for Atlanta, right? We can talk about this kind of boundaries of Atlanta, but there is no one kind of entering into Atlanta that exists. But if you're driving to Atlanta, that's your goal, that's what's motivating your initial action, the route that takes you to Atlanta is going to be one that does not take you elsewhere, right? So, in other words, an effective route is going to be one that eliminates the desiring, the thirsting that propels the action in the first place. So, therefore, to the extent that Jnaneshri Mitra is right, exclusions function as the meaning of all concepts, and these exclusions are affective. All-knowing, all statements about truth are driven by affect. And they have to do, that determines what's satisfactory, what's true, and what's not true. Okay. I'm talking too much, so I'm going to start trying to move along a little bit. Okay, now within comparative philosophy, the interest, the field that I work in, the interest that's compelled our philosophizing is arguably susceptible to the same argument that Spivak levies against Deleuze and Foucault. Typically, we use the same categories of analysis. We talk about epistemology, but we call it Indian epistemology, right? We talk about metaphysics, but we call it Taoist metaphysics. We have conferences and panels about whether there's ethics in Chinese philosophy and all sorts of things. But essentially what happens is that the categories, the concepts that are developed within, the quote-unquote West, in the European philosophical tradition, they shape and form how it is that non-Western philosophies are engaged. And within comparative philosophy, this has been a huge debate. In 1995, Lin Tongqi, Henry Rosemont Jr., and Roger Ames identified the most fundamental methodological issue facing all comparativists as a question. Does the imposition of modern Western conceptual categories on non-Western patterns of thought and modes of discourse with different categories promote or hinder our understanding of them? These scholars conclude that when modern Western categories and standards of evidence are used to gauge the philosophical merits of an alternative philosophical tradition, that tradition can appear only as an inferior variation on a Western theme. For decades, J. Garfield has voiced similar concerns about some cross-cultural philosophical methodologies. In 2001, he wrote that methods that interpret non-Western traditions through modern assumptions and categories facilitate the subordination and objectification of non-Western traditions. He writes, alien commentaries gain ascendancy over traditional commentaries. The hermeneutic method of the conqueror becomes a standard means of reading the vanquished, and the vanquished tradition becomes the domain of curators. Now, the interests that propel many projects in pluralizing the discipline seem to stay intact. Right? Philosophy is still a love of wisdom. Philosophy still traces itself to the Greeks 2,500 years ago. And to the extent that those who are excluded from philosophy, those whom philosophers and philosophy excludes, to the extent that those interests remain intact, the excluded will enter into philosophy only in a commodified or an objectified, translated form. And this is going to be a form that reestablishes the standard of translation, reestablishes the interests of philosophy. So personally, I want to say, and I don't want to end on this, but I do want to start wrapping up. I do want to say that I think that the prevalent institutional conceptions of philosophy leave us in something of a quandary. Clearly, the homogeneity of philosophy as a discipline is unacceptable. It's racist and it's patriarchic, right? On an institutional level. On the other hand, efforts to pluralize the discipline, right, by reaching out and accommodating feminist philosophy, queer theory, critical race theory, to the extent that these exclusions are mediated through the existing and prevalent standards of philosophy, this is not going to result in a more pluralistic and inclusive discipline. Instead, it's going to result in commodified forms that essentially reinstitute the masculine Caucasian subject of philosophy. So that's one quandary. I think that if philosophy as a discipline is anchored to Greece, and if we continue saying that philosophy traces its origins 2,500 years ago to Greece, then we should stop calling it an academic discipline. Rather, it should be more of a cultural artifact, on a par with, say, yoga, on a par with Buddhism, on a par with jazz or the blues. It's a cultural artifact of a particular not representative group of the population. Now, obviously, I work in philosophy and I don't want that to happen. But conversely, if we go on and we develop world philosophy specifically to make the subject more heterogeneous and more inclusive and equal, but we continue conceiving of philosophy as the pursuit of wisdom, as the love of truth, then I don't see how we can avoid either rendering truth and wisdom even more empty of semantic content than they already are, or just covering up the privileged center of philosophy's current subjectivity. So I think that when we think of what philosophy is, we should probably look at what it is that propels philosophizing within other traditions. The love of wisdom, the love of truth, is very much true. It is very much characteristic of a particular tradition of philosophy that historicizes itself to classical Greece. That is true. But that doesn't pertain to, for instance, the philosophizing of China, which is not motivated by a love of truth or by the search of truth. The concept true is a marginal concept within Chinese philosophy. They are interested in how to develop and sustain harmonious relations between human beings and sometimes between non-human beings. That's the motivating force of the philosophizing, if you can talk about it. Right? And then, as Srinivasi Rao wrote in her book, Indian Philosophies of Perceptual Error, I believe that's the title of it, as she wrote, Indian philosophies as a group haven't been propelled by a love of truth, by a love of wisdom, not in any kind of self-description. First and foremost, they're propelled by an awareness of deep existential problems, of quandaries. Specifically, they've been concerned about misery and different miserable aspects of living, how to minimize them. Now, there have been intense debates, intense disagreements within different schools of Indian philosophy about the characteristics of this misery, about the means and the techniques that one needs to deploy and practice in order to minimize and escape it, and also about what this liberated state consists of. Right? But the motivating force is not a love of truth. It simply isn't. Right? It's rather how to respond to lived existential quandaries. And it's in this spirit that I'd suggest, maybe we can all run up to our websites, right, and change our syllabi. I think that a more inclusive discipline could be constructed by borrowing a page from the South Asian classical philosophical conceptions. That philosophy is driven first and foremost by an awareness of immediate quandaries. Right? And I'm using this term quandaries because I don't want to say it's just an awareness of problems. Now, we all got problems, but they're not all philosophical problems. Right? But I want to say that it's a quandary is a kind of problem that requires some creative reinterpretation of concepts and practices to resolve itself. Right? So I'm also not suggesting that we now, instead of classicizing ourselves to Greece, we instead classicize ourselves to the Vedic period in India. Right? Instead, I think that this notion of philosophy as a practice that's driven by an immediate awareness of quandaries, I think that this actually describes what's happening in European philosophy as well. The threat of relativism is driven by a recognition that we need to be critical. It is driven by a recognition that some answers aren't satisfactory. And I think that in the same way that we read European philosophical texts and other texts for theses and justifications, one's skill in reading and doing philosophy is recognizing the problem that's compelling and motivating the inquiry. Because I think in each case, if you look at Kant, if you look at Descartes, if you look at all of the lines in the canon of European philosophy, you're going to find this working, philosophizing isn't occurring because of some abstract interest in curiosity or a pursuit of quote-unquote fundamental and enduring questions. Instead, it's driven by necessity, by an awareness of difficulties and effort to resolve them. Now, to the extent that we in philosophy can begin with that as our assumption, instead of bandying around what are essentially marketing words, such as love of truth and love of wisdom, to the extent that we structure our syllabi, structure how we teach philosophy from, I would suggest, this quandary approach, then what Spivak is doing is clearly philosophy. What Butler is doing is clearly philosophy. What Yancey is doing is clearly philosophy. Post-colonial, decolonial theory are clearly philosophy. And not just philosophy, as in they belong in the club, but they're some of the most interesting and compelling philosophies that deal with our present predicaments. So that's my modest proposal. Thanks. Please.
I was wondering, do you think of your modest proposal as kind of just being another way of establishing pragmatism and a pragmatic understanding of philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, not really, right? Because, there is a kind of pragmatic spirit that's motivating this, but less than kind of an interest in pragmatism. I do have an interest in pragmatism, but really, my philosophizing is motivated by problems, right? And so that's how I make sense of my own work. And one of the other things I like about this approach is that you don't necessarily have a zero-sum approach to different philosophical perspectives. Right? Philosophy is motivated by different problems. I don't think that these problems need to be enduring or timeless. But even if you are responding to the same problem, there are different exercises that can be useful in different contexts. So there is a kind of pragmatic spirit there. Right? I can be a rationalist at particular moments of inquiry. I could be an empiricist at others. And this is effectively what scientists do anyway. philosophy is supposed to give us tools that help us to respond to lived realities. And you can practice yoga, right, and the categorical imperative, I would think, simultaneously. So maybe there's a pragmatic spirit, but maybe it's just my unprincipled, hypocritical nature.
Thank you very much for your talk. I love what you said about philosophy as responding to queries. And it reminds me of Epictetus, who said that, we do the logic to find out whatever may be true or not, but that's not what we're about. What we're about is learning how to live well. And, the Stoics were interested in philosophical therapy. Plato said everything he wrote was for the sake of reminding his students of things. So you don't see people saying, I'm doing this for the sake of truth. We say that about them. But I want to question you about one thing.
Yeah.
You brought up something really interesting, that the non-translated form of worldview appearing in the academy.
Mm-hmm.
And the difficulty of that is, I would say, we begin with what we know, and we're the teachers.
Absolutely.
And so
Yeah.
there has been some progress, I believe. The fact that we can report on other traditions in a language that makes sense to us all
Yeah.
shows that that works. And when you were speaking, it sounded like you're presenting it as a closed door, like this is a dead end, we can't make it work by pursuing these efforts. Was that wrong?
No, I hear what you're saying, and part of it is that I've got a lot more that I wanted to say, but I hadn't actually practiced saying it, right? So I'm looking at the clock and being like, okay, that's out, that's out, that's out, right? So maybe I wasn't as kind of subtle as I wanted to be. I mean, this proposal, I think we're already doing this in our philosophy classes. We have to do this in our philosophy classes. If you're teaching intro to philosophy and you're talking about epistemology, students don't immediately recognize, oh, this is an important, urgent question. All right, you've got to contextualize it. All right, and so I think that we're already, to an extent, practicing philosophy with an attention to resolving problems, whether they're persistent or not. All right, I think already at the institutional side of the university, to some extent, we were doing this. But the problem is that we've got a way, so it's going to be grammatically awkward. The problem is that we've got a way too narrow conception of problems. Right? And our focus is, because we equate with truth, we're talking about, there can only be one answer. Right? So, we would think that Zhuangzi and Descartes have to be enemies, mortal enemies. Right? And that's not necessarily the case. Right? So I'm arguing for a more expansive and inclusive conception of philosophical problems. And I'm arguing for a shift away from attention to truth as the primary teleological concept of philosophy, to a question of quandaries, for lack of a better term, as a motivating force, the interest that would shape an inclusive philosophy department. Yeah.
So, really good. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. I'm wondering what the implications be for just mainstream analytic philosophy departments right now. And they're still doing, still really good people are coming out of those departments and teaching really good things. They're great teachers, and they're still getting at, excuse me, people, the students that are coming out of them, when they're teaching, they're doing a good job. They're still having their students recognize these quandaries and everything. So if they're still getting at the same thing, I guess, like, in your opinion, you got to change. Rutgers has to change their analytic bent. They got to.
Oh, see, I think this may have been the same question that you were asking, and
yeah.
Really, that's not what I'm hoping to say at all.
Okay.
Right? What I'm hoping to say, when I've got on job interviews, basically every job interview I've gone on, right, there's been one person, and I don't think I need to name the demographic, right, that is hostile to my position, not just on the basis of argumentation, but they don't think it's philosophical. Right? And they don't think that it's philosophical because, I've collapsed into the relativism of post-structuralism, even though he has never read these texts, right? And immediately dismiss issues as being, political as opposed to philosophical, and so on. And I'm thinking that these acts of exclusion that are kicking people out of the discipline, that's what needs to stop. Right? I do think that with respect to a lot of analytic philosophy, and my training, first and foremost, was in analytic epistemology, right? I think that it's extremely susceptible a lot of times, at least in the 20th century, to the so what question, right? And so to that extent, I do think that, there's a greater attention to the relevance, the practical relevance. of these philosophies could be appropriate. But no, I'm not saying ditch philosophy. I'm saying ditch the practices that are bringing people out of the academy. Yes, please.
So what would kind of be your program for helping to change attitudes then?
Well, I think number one, when we're teaching philosophy, studying philosophy, try not to think of it oriented to this univocal truth, right, where there's one answer. Try to think of it not as much answer directed, right, as it is what's the interest compelling this philosophizing. And I think that in our classes right now, I think good classes already do it, right, when we're introducing Kant, right, we know that Kant is trying to find a middle way, to use a Buddhist term, right, between dogmatism and mob rule. He's trying to establish the possibilities of a bourgeois position, right? But there's a problem that he's wrestling with that's motivating his inquiry. So I think that by attending to these problems in our classes and in conferences and recognizing that there are many ways to mess up in life, right? Not just with respect to the ways that philosophers have traditionally recognized, right? Then we can have a more inclusive field. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, you didn't mention Socrates, but I wonder if Socrates would be like an illustration of just what you have in mind.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, he's looking for better answers, right, to important questions, but they all have to do with improving someone's character and life and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, and also solving problems. I mean,
And not systematizing anything, really, just solving people's problems, really.
yeah. I mean, especially if the problem is that people are prioritizing, walking around with all these ideals and conceptions and appealing to them, while behaving in ways that are clearly contradictory to those beliefs, and to the detriment of the community and the society. Right? That seems to me like a quandary, right? That might propel somebody to be a philosopher.
You're probably, everyone more sort of classically interested in answering questions, solving problems, let's say the Aristotle. And for all of his faults in terms of social exclusion and stuff, but wonder is what drives it. I think wonder is sort of parallel to your idea of
I wonder. I mean, I'm a little hostile, right? And please don't take it the wrong way. I'm a little bit hostile to descriptions of philosophy as being propelled by wonder and curiosity, because especially as there's these series in the stone have shown up. Like what philosophers institutionally are curious about, right, and consider to be wonder-provoking is extremely narrow. And what they're clearly not curious about and motivated to be wondrous about, is again actually quite predictable. Right? So I do think that there can be wonder and curiosity that has to go along with solving problems. But sorry, I hope I didn't cut you off. But yeah.
No, I think that makes sense. And then the term does carry the kind of connotation of just fairyland or something.
Yeah.
But for Aristotle, I mean, he was very interested in solving problems, how people live together, what's the best way to live,
absolutely.
and how you put the state together, for whatever problems there are, because we put it together, right?
Yeah.
Still, it was like his wonder wasn't just a kind of, let's wonder, I'm wondering about all this stuff.
Yeah.
So,
No, I appreciate that.
and one last little thing. I kind of sort of overlap here, is that analytic philosophy, essentially defines itself as problem-oriented, as opposed to any kind of systematic effort to understand everything and include all the people in it, and,
Yeah.
So in an odd way, problem orientation overlaps with the analytic sort of focus.
I think for sure. At the same time, I mean, maybe this is just me. I mean, I do leave open the possibility that some things are quandaries for some people and not for others, right? I got to say that a lot of problems in contemporary analytic epistemology, I'm not laying up wicked.
Then you're so wise. Captures that pretty well.
Yeah. But no, I mean, I do think that there's a problem focus. I mean, essentially, what I'm suggesting, geometry Mitra, this is one of the things that I put out, right? His rhetorical style is fascinating, right? Because it's not oriented toward truth, right? The idea is not that this will then be a more true version of philosophy, right? That we are approaching the ideal. Rather, it's going to be a version of philosophy that at least provisionally sucks less bad, right? And then there may be other versions of philosophy. Inevitably, there will be other versions of philosophy that will correct whatever alternatives we come up with. But I do think that we as philosophers need to pursue ways of conceiving of philosophy that don't just appeal to the institutional forms that presently exist. Yeah. Henry?
Yeah, so I'm interested in, I think
One thing I was thinking about is that the important difference seems to be political, right? So the quest for truth seems really removed from a political act. And I think that's what I notice a lot in contemporary analytic philosophy, right? So in the very sort of minute epistemology, there's simply no politics. Or there is very much to conceal.
Yeah.
And it seems like at the same time there's a lot of resistance to have political action within the academy and within through philosophy. And so I'm wondering why you think that is, or how we can perhaps get over that. Why do we have a resistance to qualify our activity as political activity?
Well, I think part of the reason is that people aren't recognizing that the depoliticized philosophy is a highly politicized form, right? So, I mean, to the extent that philosophy is depoliticized, I mean, essentially what we're doing is we're pretending as if we're writing from a non-political context, which, especially when you look at Spivak's work, right, and Lugonis's work, this is clearly not the case, right? And so this is part of my concern is that I think concern with truth is it's this abstract conception of truth that, I mean, God's dead now, right? It's not as if people have one singular conception of truth within the philosophy academy, right? They can house heterogeneous conceptions of truth. So it's not specific, it's highly abstract, but at the same time appeals to truth as a depoliticized notion, actively exclude, you know, the overtly political, right? And in that sense, I find it problematic, right? I think the pursuit of truth, at least in current institutional states, I think it's a brand, right? I think it's an empty concept. Where if we reorient or question what it is that propels philosophical inquiry, then we might maybe resolve that problem. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, this is a follow-up. I also kind of wonder if that's linked to economic conditions, right? So it seems like European universities are in a way much more politicized, right? So you can really have a left-leaning faculty or different faculty. And it seems like, especially in North America, where education has been increasingly commodified, that's also come with the price of this sort of seemingly depoliticized act.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think there are some, I'm sure history's already written about it. I've definitely heard in conversation, and I've personally suspected that difference may be due to, you know, the fact of McCarthyism and the effect of blacklisting on the U.S. Academy. You know, because it's not as if the American Academy wasn't, you know, really pretty radical and interesting right before the 50s. But yeah, I'm not sure.
Just to try and make sense of the picture that you're trying to paint, I'm wondering, like maybe I'm wrong, but are you imagining philosophy departments as being akin to like a liberal university, which is liberal not in like a liberal party sense, but liberal in the sense of tolerating or providing a space for whatever people to do whatever sort of they want for whatever purposes, for whatever goals.
Oh, I
but
agree. Kind of anarchist.
But not taking a stand on any of those aside from saying we will tolerate it.
I'm really glad you brought that up because I mean part of the goal is, you know, this is supposed to be non-relativistic, right? So I'm looking for a conception of philosophy that is not relativistic, that you can practice in the institutional space of the university without it descending into kind of postmodern pastiche, right? And this problem orientation or quandary orientation is supposed to be one way of navigating beyond that. Again, if you think back, I think, to introduction philosophy classes, and I find myself teaching this way, you know, what are the central problems of philosophy? You know, what is just, right? What should I do? What exists? How do I know? Right? One way of formulating the central problems of philosophy. I just want to suggest that philosophical traditions and problems are much, much, much wider than that. For instance, how do I deal with the fact that life is hard? Right? Every aspect of life is difficult. What ought one to do, if anything, to ameliorate or reduce that difficulty? Right? That seems to me like an urgent philosophical problem, but it's treated as peripheral. Right? And so that's the thing, is I think that by taking one narrow conception of philosophy as the money form of all philosophy, that we're missing out on a lot of philosophical inquiry, or at least diminishing it. You know, Chinese philosophy isn't philosophy. Like, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard that. Now, that doesn't mean that philosophy, Chinese philosophy doesn't have rigor, right, in its own form, and that practicing, say the Ru tradition or practicing as a Taoist is extremely challenging in a different sort of way. Just as an aside, I don't know how we're doing time-wise, but Dr. Buckley's going to hate this, I think, right? But when I teach symbolic logic, I personally conceive of it as a kind of arcane, esoteric, almost mystical kind of European yoga, right? You're yoking your cognitive habits in very specific ways.
Oh, I actually kind of love that.
Okay, good. You're yoking your cognitive habits in particular ways. But one of the things that yoga teaches is that there's all sorts of ways of being undisciplined, and there's all sorts of habits that need to be yoked. And I think right now our traditions of philosophy have only focused on a ridiculously narrow set of problems to our detriment.
What do you have any thoughts on how this might tie in with the role or the absence of the role of the public intellectual, particularly here? It's not so much in Europe, but
Right.
we hardly have any public intellectuals here.
Yeah.
And to the extent we have them, they're like journalists. There's nothing wrong with some journalists, right? But I mean, you just don't see folks in the academy talking, philosophers particularly.
I hear, I mean, certainly not credentialed philosophers.
Yeah.
Right? You definitely hear that not credentialed philosophers, not people who get their PhDs, definitely not people who are in mainstream, affluent kind of presses, right? But here in Atlanta, you're going to find a number of people who are theoretically aware, right? Maybe not in terms of the boundaries of philosophy, right? Theoretically extremely educated and very active in organizations and solving problems, right? And in that sense, I think of them as public intellectuals, public philosophers. Right? It could be that most interesting philosophy, and I've got to say I suspect this, that some of the most interesting philosophers and philosophies are not housed in philosophy departments, at least in contemporary contexts. I don't know how much time we have, so I keep looking up there and maybe trying to rush myself too much.
We'll go with one more question if we have one.
The next conference session is not till 3.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. Unfortunately, nobody needs to drink or anything like that.
Here we've got a question.
Oh, please,
So,
thank you. Yeah.
Sorry I was late, so I was going to talk, but I'm going to ask my question anyway based on the conversation I heard. I want to ask about the practicality of your suggestions. It seems that your suggestions that we should maybe focus on these peripheral questions, that seems very interesting, as opposed to the central big questions that we've been focusing for centuries.
Yeah, so part of what I was doing was problematizing that axis, right, between the kind of central big questions and the peripheral questions. And I argued that that's partially a legacy of global capitalism and coloniality, right? So, I do think, how do we deal with life's difficulties? Like, how do we respond to life's difficulties? This is a big question, right? And it's a central question. I'm not saying that we now need to orient, and all of us need to orient philosophy in the same way, right? But I do think that when we are teaching philosophy and doing philosophy, we need to think critically about what questions we assume to be central, what questions we assume to be big, and so on. Because oftentimes all we're doing is just reflecting and encouraging and perpetuating the privilege of a very narrow demographic. And in the process, encouraging good students and good philosophers to go into different departments and programs.
So it seems to me that we can't really ask these peripheral questions unless we have a position on the central one. So for example, you're already assuming that we have to overcome the difficulties of life instead of embracing them, for example, right? So that is a position you're taking already.
I think that's inaccurate. I think I said that life is difficult. How should we respond to these difficulties?
Okay.
Right.
And my question then is, it seems to me that if you think of philosophy not as focusing on certain subjects and trying to understand what those subjects are, but but rather a practice, like teaching a skill.
Mm-hmm.
That skill is basically asking questions, and then once you've done that, the students would automatically start asking these questions and try to answer those questions by themselves. So you don't really need to change maybe the way that we teach philosophy, but maybe focus on what we are teaching. It's not the knowledge that we're teaching, but the skill, and once those students get the skill, they will start asking these questions by themselves and try to answer them.
Right, I
anyway.
appreciate that. I'm wondering if anybody else would care to respond to that question. In the spirit of inclusivity, is there a hand? Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that doesn't work from what I've heard, if I understand the problem correctly, is that Western philosophy has been taken as central, and the problems that have come out of that have shaped the method. And so that's why we have to start maybe looking, and I think this might be your suggestion, that by understanding that, things like what is true or what is truth, absolutely, by understanding that, if that's your goal, that's going to formulate your method. And then if you use that method to then, look at other goals, then it doesn't seem like you've actually broken down the structure that you were planning to worry that seems to be the problem, right? So we actually have to look at, well, what other kinds of problems are central, and then if that was a central problem, what kind of method will we use to deal with that problem? And so I think that's
a really, and I'm glad you brought up the issue. I mean, I was calling it commodification or objectification, but essentially, I also wanted to bring up Dipesh Chakrabarty's work, in post-coloniality and the artifice of history, where basically, he's writing as somebody who's a member of the Subaltern Studies Collective and a historian, and he's responding to congratulations that finally Indian philosophers are writing their own histories. But what he says is that what we need to recognize is that the sovereign subject of all history, not just European history, is at the institutional side of the academy, European. Right? It's a European subjectivity. And when histories are conducted, non-Europe, it's actually quite easy. Right? All you have to do is take the concepts and models and categories and apply them to these other contexts. It's a great publishing gig. Right? You can publish out the wazoo by doing this. You take a kind of theoretical, philosophical frame that's already established, and then you just extend it almost mechanically into these other contexts. And the result is that the engagement with excluded others essentially becomes an empirical exercise. Right? So we've learned these skills, right, these central skills in traditional philosophy classes as you've described, and then we go off and we apply them to these other contexts. Well, what happens is that as we apply them into these other contexts, we're not transformed by engaging with these other contexts. We just engage in the process of assimilating them into our additional view, which has historically and contemporaneously, right, been associated with coloniality.